Everybody, welcome to the newest class, the newest virtual class that we're having here at Fossil Creek Nursery. Like always, my name is Jackson Foote. I am the retail manager over here at the store, and I am always happy to do these classes. This class, of course, is going to be all about growing fruit in Colorado. And it's a very generic kind of topic. I'm going to be delving into different kinds of fruits, how to take care of them, issues associated with them, everything pretty much under the sun concerning some of the fruit that we can grow here. Now, to start, I just kind of like how I've been in a couple of these other classes. I'd like to divide up some of these fruits into a couple different, just kind of groups. Essentially, we're going to have our trees, which are going to be, all of our tree fruits, your apples, peaches, plums, cherries, all that whatnot. You have your vines, which are going to be, of course, mostly grapes. The goji berries, fairly vining as well. And then you're going to have your shrubs, which, of course, consist of the blueberries, raspberries, as well as some blackberries, although those kind of can be more of a vine itself. But I mean, starting out, I would love to start out with some of our fruit trees, which of course are going to be some of the most popular types of fruit that people grow around here, and often they will do very, very well. So, start off, let's talk a little bit about apples. Apples are going to be probably one of the hardiest fruit trees that you can grow around here. They often have very low zones. Zones, of course, being environmental zones. It dictates temperatures and environmental conditions that are suitable for different plants. Most apples are going to be zones, I would say, 3 to 5 or 6. Some of the more popular varieties in the store may end up being 7 or 8, but quite a few, a surprising amount actually, are in those lower zones and are very easy to grow around here. My favorite, of course, being the Honeycrisp Apple. But going into apples a little bit more here, as far as the tree and how well it does, apples can be very drought tolerant trees. They are in the genus called Malus, which of course is in the rose family. And many things in the rose family are fast growing, very tolerant of our alkaline soils here. Sometimes they can be very drought tolerant, often have very pretty flowers, and a bunch of them have edible fruit. So, to start with apples, talking a little bit more about just how hardy they are. When people come to the nursery and they ask, okay, which fruit tree is the hardiest for Colorado? Of course, this is just like asking, what's your favorite song or what's your favorite movie? It's a very difficult question to answer, and it is very, very variable in, of course, different places around the state, around the town, around all different kinds of areas. But I will generally give them the answer apple because there are so many that do very well. Now, apples are an interesting one in that every apple tree needs a pollinator. Now, pollinators is another thing I'm going to go into a little bit more here, but essentially that means that if you have a singular apple tree with nothing else around it, no other apple trees, no other crab apple trees, you are not really going to get any fruit. You might get a little bit, there might be some type of slight pollination that's going on, but the yield is not going to be anything like you want it to. Um, and like I mentioned, a pollinator would be a separate tree, a different tree. You need two if you're growing apples. You need two different apple trees. And once you do that, your yield can drastically increase. And apples need a pollinator just because they cannot pollinate themselves on the exact same tree. Also, they are insect pollinated by bees, some flies, but mostly going to be our bees, of course. Um, so, once you have decided that you need two apple trees there, then you can start to kind of go through the varieties and figure something else out. Now, of course, I mentioned my favorite apple is one called the Honeycrisp Apple. Many of you may be aware of that already. Very large apple, very sweet, great, just kind of firm texture as well. Um, One thing you want to be careful with when you're picking a pollinator for your apple is that they have a couple different um, similarities, is what I'll say. So, you have the variety. We're going to use Honeycrisp as an apple. You know that it's hardy, you know that it would do well, and you decide you need a second one. Now you have to check on the bloom time of that specific fruit tree. In this case, it's an apple. Honeycrisp apples are a quote unquote mid season bloomer. Now, there are early, mid, and late season bloomers. Early season bloomers are going to be, of course, the first to bloom in the spring, and that would be when they would need to be pollinated, of course. So, if you have an early season blooming apple and you decided that you wanted another variety, which you later found out was a late season bloomer, then you may not get any fruit because that early season bloomer will have already flowered and been pollinated by the time the late season blooming apple actually opens up. So, while you do need a pollinator, you want to be a little bit meticulous about what other kind of tree that you're using there. Now, that is just with bloom time as well. There's other statistics that you're given when you're picking apples, what the fruit's good for. Some is not all great for fresh eating. Some of it's better for baking or canning. Probably less with apples for canning, but of course you can. um, Another thing that you want to kind of keep in mind is the maintenance of those trees. If you are familiar with the Front Range and people loving to plant fruit trees, you are also familiar with the immense amount of breakage that happens on these fruit trees. Specifically, apples and some of the larger fruits like peaches or plums will have just massive fruits on a very small stem. And when I talked about earlier about how apples are in the rose family and they're very often very vigorous, this is 100% true. Apple trees, fruit trees, they can grow a foot or more per year. And it's not like they're growing a foot of a stem that is a actually thick stem. They are very small, very thin stems that are putting off this growth. They are flowering off of those new growth stems, and any flower, if it's pollinated, can become a fruit. So you have your Honeycrisp apple or any other fruit tree that has grown a foot last year out, and it has 5, 6, 7 buds on it that are going to be flowers, that are going to be fruit. It is extremely important to be pruning your fruit trees. If you think about some of the orchards down in Palisade, those trees are not very big. They, every single year, they will prune those things into this very boxy shape. The best fruit tree is only about 4, 5, 6 feet tall, only about maybe 5, 6 feet wide. That is because if they are consistently pruned, they're always branching. The more branching you have, then the more caliper, the more girth, the thickness of that stem you have. It is a stronger stem. It can hold more fruit. It can actually not break because you're creating a larger stem. And on top of that, you also don't have to go up very high to pick the fruit, which of course is another problem. Once you get these apple trees that you've never pruned, they get to be 20, 25 feet tall. And I mean, who's getting up on a ladder going all the way up there? If you do, I commend you greatly. But it is often not the easiest thing to have happen. So it is very important to prune your fruit trees. Okay, so we have an apple. We have decided that it is hardy. We like this variety. We have picked a pollinator for it, which of course would be at that same bloom time, because you want to have these two trees flowering around the same time. They can get pollinated at the same time, and you don't miss any of that pollination time. Again, late, early, middle, these are all different terms for the time of flowering, and you want to make sure that they coincide. That is kind of a rough run through of just fruit trees overall. I like to say apples again because I find them to be very hardy around here, and they can be fairly drought tolerant over time. Now, I would kind of like to talk a little bit more about some of these other fruit trees. We went through apples, and I mean, pruning them is going to be important too, because if you have a massive tree and it's all blooming and it's getting pollinated, it's going to create a mess down on the ground. So definitely keep in mind what's going to be going on and what the eventual size you want this apple tree or any other fruit tree to be. Cherries are generally what I consider to be the second most hardy around here. It is a subjective opinion. It's just from what I've seen. Specifically, the sour cherries do very well around here. Sweet cherries can very much be borderline. I will, if I do suggest some, I usually suggest a variety called Stella or Rainier. They tend to do very well around here. I've actually heard of people growing a Stella cherry up in Estes Park before, which I haven't personally put my eyes on, but it was an interesting story to hear. But anyway, going back to some of those sour cherries, they are great because a lot of them will naturally not get super big. They many times do not need a pollinator. Sour cherries often do not need any kind of pollinator. So they will produce fruit essentially on their own with little care or little, ulterior pollination techniques. And they often do not have a whole lot of problems either. Now, sour cherries are not the best for, of course, fresh eating, but making jams, jellies, or doing anything like that, they are very proficient with. Um, to talk a little bit more about how sour cherries do not need pollinators, it is also important to know that if you provide a pollinator for something that does not need it, it will drastically increase the yield of that fruit. So, say I have one of my favorite sour cherry varieties, the sweet cherry pie, which is kind of a misnomer because it's a sour cherry. It does not need to be pollinated, often can taste sweeter, but if I just have a single one of those, it is not going to get super big. It's not going to have a lot of yield on it. So if you wanted to increase that, you can go ahead and, well, get another sour cherry. And now for sour cherries, most will bloom at fairly the same time, but there are different bloom times for those as well. This is a little bit different when you start to talk about sweet cherries. A lot of the sweet cherries around here, some of them can be different species. Now, different species of cherries or plums, they may not be compatible pollinator for each other. So you want to make sure that when you are purchasing a fruit tree, especially a plum or, excuse me, sweet cherry, that you're having very similar species there because you want them to be compatible with that pollination. Again, cherries and most of these other fruit trees are going to be insect pollinated. So you just want to make sure that they are close enough together that you're getting some cross pollination from those pollinators. Of course, most of them and most regularly are bees. So, a little bit about that. Um, that kind of covers just the brief sour versus sweet cherry. Again, sour cherries tending to be a little bit more hardy, not getting as big, often not needing pollinators. And then we talked a little bit about the sweet cherries, which of course have the cherries that you would see in the store and the supermarket. They will need a pollinator. You just got to make sure that they are similar species, or else you may not get what you're looking for as far as a compatible pollinator. And also just making sure that you have similar bloom times for these as well. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the plums. Plums have, of course, a long history here in Fort Collins, the Front Range, and really all around North America. Very, very great fruits in my opinion. My favorite variety of plum is one called Stanley plum, which is actually an older variety, does very well, does not need a pollinator, but like we talked about with cherries, the addition of a second tree would drastically increase the yield for the Stanley plum. There are a ton of other plum varieties that I could mention. Black Ice is a good one. There's a Superior plum, the Toka plum, but all of those will need a pollinator. Superior doesn't necessarily need one. But plums are kind of that weird fruit that a lot of them need pollinators and a couple of them don't. So I would, of course, check with either the internet or if you're at a garden center, just ask around. They should either have a handout to give you, or they should have the information present that they can dictate between something that needs a pollinator or something that doesn't. Plums often do very well around here. They are another one that is super fast growing and thus very important to prune. They also have a very rich history. Back in the 70s, there were so many Stanley plums around here, especially in Fort Collins, a very, very popular tree. And often they do very well for, I would say, 20, 30 years sometimes. But plums are in the genus Prunus. And Prunus is a genus that really has a ton of different plants in them, and stemming from trees to shrubs. There might be even be a couple vines too. But that genus is very fast growing, and often because of that may have some insect problems, which is something else I would love to mention that I notice a lot with plums. They can attract, especially if the tree is under stress, they can attract a little insect called a prunus borer. This especially happens when like I mentioned, when trees are under stress, or if your tree is planted directly next to grass. If you have your grass coming directly up to the base of that tree, a lot of insects that bore into trees like to live out some of their life cycle in the grass surrounding the tree. So I would suggest for any fruit tree, give them a little bit of space, a little bit of a mulch circle when you go to actually put that tree in the ground, and just to help with later care. There are a ton of other benefits of giving a little mulch circle to any of your plants, and I'd be happy to go through that, but essentially it is a lot of information, and it is time, that would be another class worth. So that kind of talks about plums. Again, fast growing, great fruit. One of my favorite varieties is Stanley. It does not need a pollinator, does very well. A lot of plums do need pollinators. Again, make sure that your bloom times are the same and that you are pruning these. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit more about peaches. Peaches are one that everybody wants to grow around here. I probably get more calls here at the nursery about peach trees than any other tree. And that is because, of course, we have our famous Palisade peaches that grow, down south. And I think it is lost on quite a bit of people how much better of an environment it is to grow peaches down there than it is up here. That is not to say you cannot grow peaches up here. There are tons of people that do, and often they will do very well. However, peaches tend to have a couple problems here and there. Just like with apples and plums, peaches of course have large fruits and also grow very, very fast. I mean, they can put off a foot of growth probably every year for a good 7 to 15 years, depending on how happy they are. So you definitely want to make sure to prune those peach trees. It is essential that you do this. Many peaches, almost all peaches actually, are self-pollinating, so you do not necessarily need a second peach tree there, but it will drastically increase your yield. Peach trees also are notorious for blooming very early. In fact, we have a couple in the store right now that are currently blooming, but we can't really throw them outside yet because, well, it's too cold and those blooms would get nipped in the next couple snows that we have coming up. So between them being notoriously early blooming and also growing very fast, they do require a bit of maintenance. Also, peach trees are, many of them are a borderline zone, maybe being zone 5, maybe a couple are zone 4. So you want to make sure that you are giving them the water necessary, letting them dry out before you water again. What I would suggest for any tree, any fruit tree especially, is deep infrequent waterings. If you are letting your lawn irrigation water primarily, I would definitely suggest throwing some mulch on top of that root zone, going out there with a hose, and then watering deeply, letting it dry out before you water again. This is going to help a lot with surface roots in your lawn. If you ever see a large tree in your lawn that has big surface roots, it is more than likely because whoever planted that there never took the time to physically go up to the tree and water it, deep water it. They just let their lawn irrigation handle it. I mean, the tree's alive, it's doing fine, but now you have all these surface roots because you did not deeply water your tree, which told all those roots to follow the water. Anyway, little tangent there. But back to peaches. Beautiful flowers on those. And if you have a second tree, you can really boost up the yield that you're getting. Like I mentioned, they are not necessarily not a tree that needs another pollinator, but of course, increasing your yield would be beneficial. I had mentioned earlier with the pruning that down in Palisade, those peach trees are not very tall, they're not very wide, but they are dense. That is how fruit trees should be. If you do not, then you will get breakage at some point. Again, peach trees, apple trees, sweet cherries, plums, even some sour cherries, they're growing so fast. And a stem that is no bigger than maybe even your finger cannot hold all of the fruit that's getting put on it, at least from those flowers that turn into fruit. So you want to make sure that you're pruning it. And you can prune fruit trees pretty heavy. They do not mind. The more branching you get, the stronger those stems are, the thicker those stems are, and the more fruit it can actually hold, and the more fruit can be easily accessible to you. So, that's a little bit about peaches. Now, I think that pretty much covers the major fruit trees around here. I could talk about apricots for a little bit. I would treat very similar to the rest of these fruit trees with the deep watering, with the pruning. Apricots, most of them will need a pollinator, and they tend to have similar insect issues to plums, with some boring insects or maybe just aphids here and there. That is another thing that I'll talk about here in a second. Are insects on fruit trees and how to take care of those. But I'd like to talk about a couple other fruits first because a lot of the techniques for insect control will carry over into these other plants. So now we'll talk a little bit about the vines. Grapes, of course, being the most popular. They do very well around here. They are very drought tolerant and often very sun tolerant too. I would not consider any of the fruit trees to be truly xeric, although with proper establishment they can act like it. But going back to grapes, of course, you have your white grapes, red grapes, black grapes, which are the ones that we, of course, see in the store. And there are varieties of all three of those that grow well around here. For white grapes, I mean, you have your seedless and non-seedless. I would say that if you're on the front range here, both would perform very well. Seeded grapes tend to be just a little bit hardier, but again, that is more subjective from what I have seen. Your red grapes are very similar. I would actually say that maybe with the exception of black grapes, the white and the red do very well with fairly minimal maintenance. However, they are a vine, so you want to keep in mind that you would like to have them growing up on something. I've seen people use trellises. I've seen people use swings that are covered by a wooden frame to grow things on. Some people will have big beams or kind of either wire or wood across a top of a structure that they're allowed to vine on and grow. But the cool thing about grapes is that once you do have a structure for them to grow on, they will be pretty good producers. I have seen, I mean, just amazing vineyard type areas where people have allowed their grapes to grow up in over structures and then just pick grapes from beneath. It is actually super cool. But like I mentioned, they're very sun tolerant. I would never put a grape or any other fruit tree for that matter in the shade, and can often be pretty great at producing. Grapes don't necessarily need a pollinator. Of course, with the addition of one, they might end up producing much more fruit. But they are just a great plant to grow around here. They get a very nice woody stalk, a base, and they can also be cut back and pruned as necessary. But if given a structure, it is not particularly necessary to give them a hard prune like you would fruit trees. So grapes are pretty great. Not particularly awesome fall color or whatnot, but they definitely can if given the right environment. More of a golden there. Not much else to say about grapes other than great climbers. If you give them a structure, they do well. Again, addition of a pollinator would help with the yield, but it's not necessary, and keep them in sun for sure. Now, let's talk a little bit about blackberries because they are a good transition from vine to shrub. There are some blackberries that will vine very heavily and take over a pretty decent amount of area. Now, these I would always suggest pruning, and there are not as many blackberry varieties that I would suggest around here as I would like, but that is just because there are really only a handful that are truly hardy around here. Um, Blackberries, the difference between them and, excuse me, a grape or a fruit tree is that they can take a little bit more water. Very similar to raspberries, is that they are uh, pretty water resistant if you give them a heavy amount. Many blackberries will be thorned. There are a couple that are thornless, but they are also self-pollinating as well. So you wouldn't necessarily need to buy another plant to cross-pollinate them. Uh, they are really one that is less used around here than some of the other fruit trees, fruit shrubs, fruit vines. So if you have one, you're kind of one of those that is going against the grain. Not a lot of people have the blackberries. So that is a really cool one. I mentioned they're a good transition from vine to shrub because there are much more vining varieties and there are much more shrub-like varieties. In recent years, they have made a big push to cultivate more of the shrub-like blackberries that don't have any thorns on them. However, less cultivated blackberries will more than likely have thorns. But great plant. I don't think it's used enough, especially the varieties that, of course, do well around here. Uh, Talk a little bit about raspberries. They are kind of a bit different. They are always going to be very shrubby, although they will spread. They definitely will spread over time. They are like blackberries in that they are very vigorous and that they can take water. They also may not need to be pollinated by another shrub. A lot of raspberries will be self-pollinating. However, like I mentioned, they will spread, so if you're planting a raspberry, you need to make sure you're giving it room. There are a couple different kinds of raspberries. It is actually a really interesting shrub. There's been a lot of cultivation done, and there's been a lot of um, kind of different varieties popping up that are different colors, that are sweeter, that do different things. Older raspberries actually needed a couple seasons to produce. They would put up the canes first, you'd have to cut those down to a certain degree, and then the next year's growth is what would actually produce raspberries. There's a difference. There's a type of raspberry that is primacane, and a second that is, oh my goodness, the name is blanking me right now. But there, if you look it up, primacane versus, gosh dang it, there's another type of cane there. But essentially, it dictates the difference between first year growth and second year growth for producing raspberries. Again, one that is very water tolerant. They're very vigorous, can take water very well. Definitely a great sun plant. They can be a bit shade tolerant, but to really produce, they would like to be in sun and have a little bit wetter feet. But that's a good little deal about raspberries there. I really could talk for multiple classes on different fruits. We could have a whole class on trees and shrubs and vines, but just kind of trying to run through them here. And another type of kind of shrubby fruit that I'd like to talk about are more of our native fruits. Like our currants are really nice. You have your service berries, which are really nice. Um, Goodness, what is another one? I have even seen people use the elderberries a lot as well, but these are all going to be more of your shrubby type fruits. And for more native fruits, often they need a lot less care. Natives are used to the area, they're used to the state, and they will produce with a lot less conditions or requirements. So your service berries are terrific. self-pollinating, also in the rose family. They almost taste like a raspberry mixed with a blueberry. Terrific. We suggest them not only as an ornamental tree around here, but sometimes as shade tree and very xeric, with little white flowers. Just a terrific tree. You have your currants, your alpine currants, your wax currant, your golden currants. All those are again natives, very drought tolerant, sun tolerant, and because they're natives, they don't often need a ton of excess or supplemental water. You have your elderberries, which aren't necessarily native to the Front Range or the area, but are just another great example of a shrubby, tough fruit-producing plant. Elderberries are a little bit different in that they're not really as drought tolerant. I would suggest giving them a little bit more water, a little bit more protection, but they are used medicinally all over the place. Their fruit also has some discrepancies as well. I have been told in the past by a couple professors and from some of my coworkers here that the color of the berry will matter for edible fruit. I forget if it is the red or the black. I believe it is the red that is less edible than some of the other elderberry around, but something to keep in mind. Using shrubs as fruit-producing plants is kind of the big one. So your trees and your shrubs are going to have the most amount of plants that will produce fruit for stuff like this. Now that we talked about a little bit about the different fruits in Colorado, I'd like to briefly touch on some of the insect control for this stuff. I will use a lot of the fruit trees as examples, and that is because I usually see them on those. The gooseberry. The gooseberry is another really great shrub that produces fruit, and I thought of that because it tends to have a lot of, or really a lot of this one specific insect on it, which is actually a little caterpillar, which is kind of cool, until it eats your entire shrub. But anyway, there are a couple different ways to deal with insects on fruit trees and fruit-producing shrubs and vines. If it is something like an aphid that is just on the leaf, I wouldn't necessarily suggest going to a degree of using a systemic chemical, meaning that it is fed through the roots or leaves and is moved all around the plant. I would much more suggest something foliar, an application like a spinosad soap here. This is, of course, a much more organic product. This is something that you can attach to a hose and spray directly on it. This is going to be, of course, a contact sprayer. It's not going to be systemic, and it would do a very good job getting rid of aphids or other leaf-feeding insects on some of your fruit trees, shrubs, vines, whatnot. So definitely a good one to keep in mind. Spinosad has a lot of different uses, and especially if it's not a bad infestation, you can use something like that. If your problem ends up getting a little bit worse, that is when you can use different kinds of sprays. I have one in front of me here that has a compound called pyrethrin in it, which is, of course, not necessarily organic in this form, but is used a little bit more for a larger infection, or if you kind of need to get a specific insect off. Again, the pyrethrin is not a systemic, it is a contact spray. It's just a little bit, it has a little bit more of an umph when you're trying to control specific insects. That is another good one. I also was looking for products while I was getting ready for this class, and I found a Dormant fruit tree spray. Now this one, its label specifically talks about some scale insects that might be present on fruit trees, and scale is a lot of times easier to see in the off season, but something like that maybe, I mean, the reason I brought it up was purely because it's not just aphids, it's not just Japanese beetle, it's not just these common insects. There are others, like scale, which can be present on your fruit trees. So definitely make sure to, every once in a while, check the stems of your plants. Scale loves to hang out in the stems. They love to hang out in the petioles, which of course is the little stem at the base of the leaf. Um, and a lot of times they can be hard to see. So just, I would say, keep up with maintenance and the observation of your plants as well. Finally, which is not really an insect, but could be a quote unquote pest for your fruit trees, is going to be birds. They love to, of course, eat the fruit that's off the trees. That is what they would naturally do. So, especially for cherries or service berries, some of these smaller fruits, and it could happen on your shrubs or vines too. Um, you can set up netting. And netting is going to allow essentially a barrier so those birds cannot, or even squirrels for that matter, can't really break through, and you can keep as much fruit as you possibly can. But that was just a quick touch on insect and other kind of animal control for some of this stuff. You could also, if you have more of a mammal problem like a squirrel or um, even deer for that matter, you can lay down deterrents, which essentially consist of either like a dried blood, a dried urine, or several kind of oils that or extracts that often don't have a great smell or taste to whatever may be feeding on your plants. But that was just a quick little run through as far as insect control. Disease can also become apparent on some fruit trees, but I do not want to talk too much about that here. Um, I see every once in a while some rust on the leaves of some of these fruit trees. You could have bacterial infections, especially with like your apples or whatnot. Uh, but it is not something that I want to delve too far into. I realized I forgot to mention pears. Pears are another great fruit tree as well that we were talking about. Just like with plums, some can be self-pollinating, most are not. So another really hardy plant. There are ornamental pears and fruiting pears. Of course, the ornamental will not have a very uh, useful fruit, I would say. Some can be edible, but if you're talking like a small, like Cleveland pear or Chanticleer pear that is an ornamental, they are much more used for their fall color and their flowers. And then your fruiting pears, of course, will be more used for their fruit. Generally, much like with some of the sweet cherries we were talking about, you want to be careful that you're picking the correct species of pear, or at least pears from the same region. A lot of your Asian pears will not be adequate pollinators for other other varieties of pear, or other species of pear, and vice versa. So again, that is something that I would make sure of when you're choosing a variety of fruit, specifically pears in this case. Now, we kind of went through, talked about a lot of the apples, and kind of explained what kinds of problems and care we had there. We talked about cherries, plums, pears right at the very end, peaches. Then we kind of dove into some of the vines, like the grapes and kind of blackberries, but again, that is a transition plant, and many new blackberry varieties are becoming more shrubby. Talked about a little bit about raspberries, and then some of our natives. I didn't really want to talk too much about blueberries. I have always heard conflicting information about them. The way that I would suggest doing them would be not directly into our alkaline soils, but in a potting media, either in a large pot, whiskey barrel, or raised bed. But of course, they are a nice plant. But many blueberries grow kind of in those northern boreal type climates, less in our more dry, arid southwest here in Colorado. So I kind of want to hear from you guys. Is there any questions that you guys have about growing fruit in Colorado? Any specific plants? Any specific issues you've come across? Insects, disease, pollination, pruning suggestions, or suggestions, not suggestions. I would love to answer any questions that you guys have at this moment. And if not, I might run through a couple things quickly and end it here. But go ahead and type anything in if you guys have any questions. Um, I always love talking about fruit trees, and it's a lot easier one-on-one to talk about fruit trees because just to sit down and say, here's all of the fruit that you can grow in Colorado is a generic term, and there is a lot to talk about. There's a lot of good information there, but the best way to go about this is to hone in on specific things. If anyone had a specific question about an apple, I could talk to you for another hour and a half about that specific apple or the issues, pruning, care, anything associated with it. Same thing if you had a plum or a blueberry or a goji berry, which is something I also didn't mention a whole lot of. It's not one you see around here, but definitely I have seen a couple. Here we go. When is the best time to prune peach trees? That is a terrific question, and the answer kind of depends on what you're looking for. When the peach tree is young, I would suggest pruning actually in the spring because I'm not as focused on conserving the fruit on the tree as I am creating a very dense and strong tree. And if you prune in the spring, you allow the buds further down the stem to activate and produce as much dense growth as possible. Older peach trees, I would wait until early summer because you're not quite into that really hot season of the year, so you're not stressing the tree out anymore, causing damage, and you're not pruning early, so you're not getting a whole lot more density. You're just keeping the tree in shape. But for young peach trees, I would definitely make sure to probably prune in the spring. And actually, this in this next week or two, we're going to be having a specific class on pruning. And we can talk a little bit more then about specifically with fruit trees, but essentially what I would sell you is if it's young, prune in the spring. If it's a little bit older and you're trying to conserve the fruit more and you already have a good shaped tree, then I would prune a little bit later on. In Palisade, they will prune again kind of early summer, so they get some branching, they keep some fruit, but they're not losing too much. So go ahead and open it up to a couple more questions if anybody had anything else, and if not, I might go ahead and close it up and end it here. Of course, thank you for asking the question. Um, Anybody else got anything for me? Again, you can always feel free to call the store if you have a specific question of a specific tree. I'd be happy to go into detail about those. I just didn't want to take up too much time here talking too much about one thing or the other. Um, so I'll wait a couple more seconds here if anybody has any questions, and then I think we'll be wrapping it up. Mm-hmm. Alrighty. Well, thank you everybody for attending that showed up, and thank you for participating. I, again, would love to spend so many more hours talking about fruit in Colorado, but I'm going to go ahead and close it up here. So thank you everybody for being here, and have a wonderful sunny day.